Right now, the AFU has opened a second front over Moscow. Ukrainian revenge for Kyiv has returned with a new strike, an attack that has paralyzed Russia. Factories blown into the air, emergency evacuation of Muscovites. Russians are demanding an end to the so-called SMO. Air defense has failed. Red Square is shut down, you won't believe it. Trump has increased the tension. A serious upgrade of stakes in the US, a green light for the supply of American long-range weapons. Macron has confirmed something shocking. This needs to be heard. A landing of troops in Crimea. The occupiers have begun to leave the peninsula. Our forces caught them halfway. Bridges are collapsing one after another. Hell has broken loose there, and all of this happened right now. Greetings. I'm Renata Aslanova, and we are beginning. Right now, Ukraine has broken its own record. Round 2 for Moscow. Drones have arrived again to avenge Kyiv. One of the most powerful strikes on the RF capital.
All of Moscow is burning, damn it. Everything's on fire. Absolutely everything is burning. They're firing back and they're flying right overhead.
Russian authorities report nearly 180 drones flying toward the capital, while air defense worked in emergency mode. A new wave of Ukrainian retribution has once again struck the Moscow oil refinery.
They're pounding it. More are still approaching.
Despite hundreds of defense systems around the city, the Russian capital woke up again to the roar of explosions. It seems the drone swarm feels increasingly confident in the skies over the RF, and the legend of an impregnable Moscow is falling apart.
The second successful drone attack on an oil refinery in 3 days shows Ukraine's growing capability to overcome Moscow's air defenses, stated Kirill Mikhailov. The situation with Moscow's air defense is unlikely to be worsening, quite the opposite. We've seen the installation of additional systems in recent weeks. However, Ukrainian capabilities have truly taken a step forward.
Moreover, the media is reporting not only on drone attacks but also on strikes by Ukrainian BARS ballistic missiles. And here, live on air, the results of our long-range strikes certainly cannot be hidden. Also, during the drone attack on Moscow, one of the largest shopping centers in the RF capital, Sadovod, was damaged. The scale of the fire is visible for miles. The city has entered apocalypse mode. Urgent evacuation.
Everyone's running. Seriously, everyone's running over there right now. There it went bang.
The Kremlin is visibly nervous. The heart of Russia resembles a city under martial law. And the main question is, who are they so afraid of that they've posted guards on almost every square meter?
Red Square is closed off. Machine gunners and observers are stationed on all towers, walls, and the mausoleum. Red Square is closed. Machine gunners and observers are on all towers and walls. Armored cars and armed pickups patrol the bridges.
It seems the Russian capital is preparing not for a holiday but for a siege. Trump has unexpectedly raised the stakes. According to Macron, at the G7 summit, the US president supported more decisive steps to help Ukraine reclaim territories seized by Russia. The Kremlin certainly didn't want to hear such signals.
President Trump also stated very clearly that we need to take a much tougher stance and the territory must return to Ukraine. And he's right, which is why we support the integrity of Ukrainian territory. And this is the position of the G7.
According to Macron, Trump is increasingly convinced that Russia has no intention of ending the war but is only stalling for time. Meanwhile, Ukraine hasn't just held out, it's fighting much harder than many predicted at the start of the full-scale invasion. Russia, on the other hand, is sinking deeper into its own problems. Moreover, the G7 summit showed exactly what Moscow feared most. The US and Europe are demonstrating a readiness to act together. This isn't just about political support, but also about new defense systems, long-range capabilities, and joint decisions in favor of Ukraine. It seems a very unpleasant phase is beginning for the Kremlin, as the West clenches its fist. And a real sensation. Trump stated that the Americans are ready to consider the possibility of supplying American missiles to Ukraine.
According to officials familiar with the negotiations, Donald Trump plans to ask American defense companies to produce weapons under license in Europe and Ukraine. They would very much like to have the opportunity to do this, and we will certainly look into it, Trump told reporters, taking a moment to emphasize the importance of the matter.
It seems the West has finally bet on Ukraine's victory and is going all in to ensure Russia's defeat. So there's more to come. They clearly feel something in Crimea. The Russians are hastily reinforcing with defensive structures, preparing the occupied peninsula for a possible visit from the AFU.
The Russians are reinforcing Crimean areas vulnerable to landings as they consider it a real threat.
It seems talk of a Ukrainian landing has long ceased to be a joke for the Kremlin, and Crimea is turning from a fortress into a territory of constant anxiety. There's no time to relax. Ukrainian drones are paving the way. One key railway bridge down on the Kerch to Jankoy line. Local residents are reporting dozens of explosions and a fire. Freight and passenger train traffic is completely paralyzed. Ukrainian retaliation also struck the road bridge over the North Crimean Canal and a section of railway track near Vladislavovka station in the temporarily occupied Kherson region. According to preliminary data, our forces struck the road bridges across the Promoina Strait on the Arabat Spit.
Probably not for nothing. The icing on the cake.
Urgent! Trump and Zelensky's trap has worked. Putin is being driven to surrender. The Kremlin was given a harsh ultimatum. The White House approved Kyiv's victory pact. The trap has snapped shut. Ukraine is triumphing. The Kremlin was officially stripped of its player status and is being forced to sign a peace deal. What trap has already been prepared for Putin? Watch. Trump is drawing Putin into negotiations in the US, and this could become a trap the Kremlin can't escape. Donald Trump supports the idea of a three-way meeting involving Zelensky, Putin, and the US on American soil. The plan is simple and cruel. Either Putin sits at the negotiating table under pressure from Washington, or he openly shows the world that he's the one avoiding dialogue. The Kremlin finds itself at a dead end. Before, they easily found excuses: the wrong format, the wrong venue, the wrong time. But now everything is different. When the US and Trump personally are the initiators, any refusal starts to look like a political flight. Zelensky is only increasing this pressure. The format of negotiations in the US under Trump's aegis is no longer just a meeting, it's a public stage for the whole world. Agree, and you'll have to answer directly for the war. Refuse, and your flight will be obvious to everyone. If Moscow rejects this chance too, the conversation could move to another level, a level of additional pressure, and then the Kremlin's problem won't be the venue or the format of the talks. Then they'll have to explain their reluctance to find a way out of a war that's costing Russia itself more and more. And that's a whole different level of political discomfort. For years, the Kremlin built an image of a strong geopolitical player who dictates terms to others. But now the situation risks turning into a political joke. Every time a real opportunity to sit at the negotiating table arises, the Russian side finds a new reason to stay as far away from that table as possible. And the more often this happens, the louder the world asks, who is actually afraid of negotiations? Especially since this is far from the first attempt to bring the Kremlin to the negotiating table. Earlier, Zelensky had already proposed a meeting with Putin on the sidelines of the G7 summit with the participation of the world's leading democratic states. It would seem that for a man who for years spoke of readiness for peace and dialogue, this was a great chance to back up his words. But the result was predictable. The Russian leader refused to participate. As soon as a real negotiating platform appears, the Kremlin instantly finds new reasons not to show up. First, a reluctance to meet with Zelensky, then a lack of interest in the G7 format. Now a new proposal is on the table, a meeting in the US with Trump's participation. And the impression is growing that the problem for Moscow is not the venue of the negotiations or even their format. After all, the longer this diplomatic game of hide-and-seek continues, the louder the uncomfortable question sounds. If the Kremlin truly seeks peace, why does its leader so persistently avoid a personal conversation? A man who loves to project the image of a fearless geopolitical player has, for several years now, been unable to find time for a meeting that is supposedly meant to bring the end of the war closer. And if Putin also rejects the American format being promoted by Zelensky and Trump, making excuses will become much harder because sooner or later the world may come to a simple conclusion. Perhaps it is not Kiev or the West that is running away from negotiations. After all, the ultimate record holder for avoiding peace meetings is located right there in the Kremlin. Earlier, Zelensky had already used the most direct diplomatic signal to Putin, an open public letter with a proposal to end the war and hold a personal meeting. This was not just a political gesture, but an attempt to bring the conversation to the level of a direct challenge, either dialogue or the final confirmation of the Kremlin's unwillingness to engage in it. A special emphasis was placed on the fact that Ukraine does not want an endless war and sees a real chance for its conclusion. Zelensky stated directly that the majority of Russians could also support the idea of ceasing hostilities, and that rejecting this path means a conscious continuation of escalation, which has long since gone far beyond the Kremlin's initial expectations. In fact, it was a call to exit the war, sounding like a political warning. It is important that the format of negotiations in this letter was immediately taken beyond the framework of Ukraine and Russia. Neutral countries, including Switzerland, Turkey, and Middle Eastern states, were mentioned as possible venues. Ukraine also stated its readiness in the event of a real dialogue to consider a temporary cessation of hostilities and the involvement of the United States and Europe in the process. Thus, this letter became another stage of diplomatic pressure, an attempt to move the war from the level of combat operations into the sphere of direct political responsibility. And if new negotiation formats involving the United States are being discussed today, then this step looks like a preliminary signal. Kyiv is consistently trying to bring the Kremlin into a direct dialogue, increasing the level and scale of pressure. One cannot ignore the story of Roman Abramovich, who secretly visited Zelensky for closed-door negotiations. The irony is that negotiation channels sometimes turn out to be more alive than official ones. And while Russian television talks about a monolithic vertical, in reality, this vertical has long resembled a network of separate wires that are themselves looking for where to plug in so as not to be left without power. And among these wires, people from the inner circle of the Russian elite suddenly appear, who for some reason prefer to speak not through the Kremlin, but by bypassing it. The situation looks quite amusing. Officially, no negotiations, no concessions, we dictate the terms. Unofficially, business intermediaries are quietly knocking on various doors, trying to find at least a small window for agreements. The topic of negotiations has long since gone beyond the bounds of ordinary diplomacy and turned into a political test of the readiness to bear responsibility. The United States, through a potential format involving Trump, is effectively raising the stakes to the maximum. Either Putin comes to a public conversation about the war, or the world records his refusal as a conscious evasion of dialogue. And against this background, every new initiative, from the G7 to the American platform, only narrows the room for maneuver, leaving the Kremlin with fewer and fewer neutral formulations and more uncomfortable questions without answers.
Urgent. Fuel apocalypse in Russia. Putin's game is up. Russia has completely run out of gasoline. The disaster has reached Moscow itself. It's an emergency, a trap for gas stations. The war has boomeranged back and completely paralyzed Russia. Why can't the bunker maniacs stop this shortage anymore? Watch. Putin's war has backfired. The fuel crisis has reached the heart of Russia, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. In a country that for decades called itself an energy superpower, gas stations have suddenly started imposing limits on gas and diesel. Now, fuel is sold almost like a scarce commodity. No more than 20 liters of gas and 40 liters of diesel per person. The irony is that this isn't happening in some remote area, but in the country's two main cities. The reaction of officials is even more interesting. The authorities traditionally claim there's no shortage and that supplies are sufficient. But if there's truly plenty of fuel, then why limit its sale? It seems the Russian bureaucracy has once again invented its own version of reality, where emptying tanks are called stable supplies and gas station limits mean no problems. Just recently, Russian propaganda was mocking Ukrainian fuel lines. Now, similar problems are hitting Russia itself, from Moscow and Petersburg to Rostov, Kazan, Kursk, and Volgograd. And while the Kremlin keeps talking about its economic might, in practice, a country with some of the world's largest oil reserves is suddenly starting to ration gas. It seems the main enemy of the Russian fuel industry is no longer sanctions, but the consequences of its own war. Problems have also reached Tatarstan, one of Russia's key oil regions, which ranks second in oil production and is among the leaders in refining. There, drones struck the Tanaco and Taifinke oil refineries. That's where a significant portion of the country's fuel market is supplied from. So when trouble starts at the very heart of Russian oil refining, it's no surprise the consequences quickly reach even Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's turning out to be quite awkward. Strikes are heard hundreds of miles from the capital, yet gas restrictions are being imposed right near the Kremlin. The behavior of the oil giants themselves adds a special touch of comedy to the situation. Until recently, they insisted there were no problems and that talk of a shortage was an exaggeration. But reality proved stubborn. First, restrictions appeared in the Moscow region, then in New Moscow, and now they've reached the country's largest cities. It seems the Russian authorities are trying to convince the public there's no fire while they themselves run around the house with buckets. The regions that are supposed to feed the whole country have also suffered. In the Irkutsk region, farmers are already openly talking about the threat of bankruptcy. There's not enough diesel, prices have soared to record levels, and planting work is simply stopping in some places. The Buretskoye farm has already been forced to suspend its campaign due to a lack of fuel. What a twist! An energy superpower can't even fuel its own tractors. The problem has become so serious that local farmers have been offered to fuel heavy agricultural machinery at regular gas stations. It sounds almost like a joke, but these are the very ideas officials are proposing now. However, farmers can only throw up their hands. Massive combines and tractors simply cannot operate under such schemes. And while officials dream up new ways to fight reality, diesel prices have nearly doubled since February, surpassing the 100,000 ruble per ton mark. And the most interesting part is that this is no longer just a local issue. Diesel shortages and fuel sales restrictions are being reported in at least 25 Russian regions, including Krasnoyarsk Krai, Rostov Oblast, and Krasnodar Krai. The list is constantly growing. Farmers complain they can't buy fuel even at sky-high prices, while delivery times have turned into a total lottery. And while the Kremlin pours massive resources into the war, its own agricultural sector is starting to suffocate from a lack of resources. However, while fuel rationing is just starting in Russia, the situation in occupied Crimea looks significantly bleaker. There, gasoline is gradually becoming a strategic resource. Locals spend hours waiting in lines at gas stations, but even that doesn't guarantee success. Because as soon as a fuel truck arrives at a station, the Russian military is often the first to get access to the fuel. The army that supposedly fully controls the peninsula is now taking resources for itself before the civilian population. Against this backdrop, what usually follows any shortage is starting to flourish in Crimea, the black market. Fuel is being resold through middlemen or even straight from tankers, but at prices 2 to 3 times higher than the official rate. It feels like the peninsula is slowly returning to the wild 90s, when you could only find what you needed through connections and for a lot more money. Most tellingly, the occupation authorities are already being forced to implement strict control measures. A QR code system has appeared in Sevastopol, and a limit of just 20 liters of fuel per day has been set for every car. Inspectors and officials are stationed at gas stations to ensure that drivers don't try to buy fuel more than once. The irony is that all this is happening in a territory the Kremlin has spent years showcasing as a model of successful integration. The cause of these problems is becoming increasingly clear. After a series of strikes on military logistics and fuel infrastructure, the occupiers can no longer rely on their previous stockpiles. Every strike on logistics, every damaged route, and every supply disruption is almost instantly reflected in lines at gas stations. It seems the fuel crisis, which started as a local issue, is gradually turning into another major headache for the Kremlin. The most troubling part for Russia is that this no longer looks like a temporary glitch. If a country calling itself an energy superpower is forced to ration gasoline sales, it raises a very logical question. What comes next? It seems Ukrainian strikes are increasingly hitting not just individual plants, but the very myth of Russia's inexhaustible resources. And that myth is starting to melt away faster than gasoline is vanishing from Russian gas stations.
At this moment, the Russian rear has been completely neutralized. The game is over and the rules of war have been broken forever. What the Kremlin considered a deep and safe rear has turned into a living hell and a zone of total death. The latest Ukrainian drones with artificial intelligence are burning out strategic Russian facilities. Russia's vaunted electronic warfare systems are completely powerless. Details in our report. Ukrainian drones continue to rewrite the rules of war. New Ukrainian drones are methodically destroying the enemy army's foundation, logistics. In recent days, they've struck bridges in Chonhar, Henichesk, and Amyansk, used for years to move equipment, ammo, and fuel from Crimea to the southern front. The distance to the targets ranged from 80 to 120 kilometers from the line of contact. But for the new Ukrainian drones, this has long ceased to be a problem. The main stars of the operation were the latest Ukrainian strike drones, Firepoint FP2 and IPO. The first has a wingspan of over 5 meters and can carry about 100 kilograms of explosives. The second, with a wingspan over 2 meters, is equipped with thermobaric and high explosive charges totaling about 75 kilograms. Essentially, this is a new class of cheap but highly effective weaponry that allows for strikes on strategic targets without using expensive missiles. The consequences were immediate. Traffic through Chonhar had to be closed, the occupation administration urgently sought detours, and supply disruptions have already led to fuel shortages and halted civilian bus services. It seems Ukrainian drones are gradually doing what military analysts only recently predicted, turning the logistics of the Russian group in the south into a literal survival quest. And while Russian propaganda continues to claim control over the situation, Ukrainian drones are methodically proving the opposite. Today, they are hunting more than just warehouses, headquarters, or oil depots. Now, entire transport arteries are becoming their prey, and when hundreds of tons of ammo and fuel can't reach the front on time, even the loudest statements from the Kremlin start to sound much quieter. However, the strikes on the bridges in Chonhar, Henikesk, and Armyansk are just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the increasingly precise Ukrainian drone attacks are technologies that just a few years ago seemed like science fiction. And it seems they are starting to break one of the Russian army's main advantages, a deep rear that was previously considered relatively safe. The Ministry of Defense reported that in recent months, defense forces have quadrupled the scale of destruction of enemy equipment, warehouses, and supply routes at operational depth. Artificial intelligence has become the primary assistant in this work. Where Russian electronic warfare tries to jam or spoof satellite navigation, modern Ukrainian drones essentially begin to navigate independently. A specialized onboard computer, along with cameras, continuously scans roads, rivers, forest belts, and terrain features. The artificial intelligence instantly compares the captured image with preloaded high-resolution satellite maps. As a result, the drone determines its location not by GPS, but by what it literally sees beneath it. In such situations, Russian electronic warfare measures are increasingly proving to be powerless. The most interesting part begins just before the strike as the drone approaches its target. The neural network takes over control and begins analyzing the video in real time. If the mission is to destroy an air defense system, the algorithm independently finds the launcher or radar, locks onto the target, and adjusts the trajectory for maximum precision. In fact, the machine completes the attack on its own, even under conditions of heavy electronic warfare. Moreover, modern algorithms are already learning to recognize decoy targets. While before you could set up mock-ups of equipment and make expensive munitions hit plywood, now the neural network analyzes the object's shape, texture, positioning, and even indirect signs of engine operation. In other words, hiding behind decoys is becoming increasingly difficult. Artificial intelligence also plays a distinct role even before the mission begins. For strikes at distances up to 200 kilometers, the program calculates a complex route, accounting for terrain, enemy radar locations, potential blind spots, and air defense kill zones. As a result, the Ukrainian drone doesn't take the shortest path, but the one most dangerous for the enemy. And while the Russian rear was once considered a place to rest from the war, now more warehouses, headquarters, oil depots, and logistics hubs are learning that distance is no longer an obstacle for Ukrainian drones. And while some Ukrainian drones methodically destroy bridges, warehouses, and equipment, others are meanwhile hunting for information. After all, before delivering a precise strike on enemy logistics, it's necessary to study supply routes, resource accumulation points, and defensive weak spots in detail. It seems this is exactly what Ukrainian drones are currently active with over temporarily occupied Crimea. Recently, a video appeared online which reportedly shows a Ukrainian strike drone flying over the logistics routes of Russian troops on the peninsula. Judging by the footage, the drone was in no hurry to strike, but carefully studied the territory, scouting areas through which equipment, ammunition, and fuel are moved. In other words, the drone could be gathering the very information that later turns into destroyed bridges, burned warehouses, and blocked supply routes.
There it is, look. Yeah, that's the third one.
The reaction of the Russians themselves adds a particular nervousness to the situation. After such footage appeared, Russian sources began talking about an urgent need to tighten security on the peninsula. To protect key sites and logistics arteries, occupation forces have begun deploying additional mobile fire groups to hunt for Ukrainian drones. It seems they understand better in Crimea now. If a Ukrainian drone is circling above, it could mean not just surveillance but preparation for a future strike. The Ukrainian drone revolution continues to gain momentum. Today, these are no longer just drones with explosives, but an entire ecosystem of reconnaissance, AI, and precision strikes that is erasing the enemy's advantage in the rear day by day. Ukrainian drones first find a target, then study it, and later return to strike. And if only yesterday it seemed that distance, electronic warfare, or decoys could provide safety, today the reality looks different. For Ukrainian drones, there are fewer and fewer unreachable routes, untouchable warehouses, and safe areas. That's all for this edition. We continue right now to follow the most current events to be the first to tell you about them. Don't forget to subscribe. See you